Welcome back to another round of Watch Riddles by Relative Time. Last time, a lot of you surprised me by getting 5 out of 5 and saying that you thought it was too easy. So this time, I tried to pick a few more obscure watches as well as a few well-known watches, but we'll see how it goes. In case you missed the last video, there will be some links down below. But the short version is that I'm going to give you some basic specs, a few hints here and there, maybe a visual clue, and your job is to guess what watch or watch family I'm talking about. We're going to go over 5 different riddles, and then at the very end I'll tell you the answers to each. Now, since I'm not really going to stop much in between each riddle, feel free to pause the video if you want to think about it, maybe do some research. I'll be here when you get back. Plus, remember, while I may show you a specific reference or colorway, you don't need to be that exact with your answer. As long as you're talking about the same model or family of models, you're good. So let's get things started, and for this first riddle, I'm going to call it Not an SKX. This is from a Japanese brand and utilizes a Japanese automatic movement. The original version of this 41.5mm wide watch was introduced around 1990. It was set up to be a very affordable entry-level diver, and that kind of made it this offbeat alternative to another very popular Japanese diver, as well as setting it up to be a bit of a cult favorite. Eventually the watch was discontinued, or at least we think it was discontinued because they just suddenly started disappearing. But the lineup then came back or was reintroduced around 2018. Albeit with maybe some larger versions, as well as a new case spec that really embraced the watch's nickname. And lastly, I'll just point out that the watch was well known for its creative crown placement, as well as being adopted by a part of the Italian Navy. Now for number 2, we're going to move away from the Japanese cult classics onto a true Swiss icon. And for this riddle, I'm going to call it the King of Cool. This is a Swiss-made automatic watch with a Swiss automatic movement. And one interesting historical tidbit is that the very first iteration of this watch was actually one of the very first automatic chronographs ever introduced. And I believe ever since that introduction back in 1969, some form of this watch has continuously been in the brand's collection, as well as being synonymous with racing. Now, a couple of years ago, a new version was introduced for its 50th anniversary, and for the very first time, this watch actually had an in-house movement. And lastly, as Huey Lewis would say, it's hip to be square. Moving on to number 3, and we're going to call this one the Mini. The Mini is a Japanese diver with an in-house Japanese movement. It's also a tad on the larger side at 43.4mm. This particular watch was introduced in 2018, and it almost immediately became a hit due to its resemblance to a much more expensive diver, as well as just being a massive spec monster for the price. Now, one of the confusing aspects about this watch is that it actually had 2 different nicknames simultaneously, and both nicknames were pretty similar. But the thing is, most people knew one of those nicknames, but not necessarily both. So when you were talking about it or doing a review about it, it oftentimes became confusing, and there were always questions about, hey, is this other watch? Or maybe what's the difference between the two? And lastly, I'll point out that this watch is disappointingly discontinued. Sort of. You see, the brand recently discontinued it, only to follow it up with an almost identical looking model. Although while that new model looks almost identical, it's actually missing 2 very important features. Yet, people still call it by the same name. On to number 4, and for this one, we're going to call it Never Been Caught. This is a Swiss-made watch with a Swiss movement. And the very first iterations of this watch actually date back to the 1960s. Although you could say that it was a bit of an odd duck, with a pretty unusual aquatically themed case shape, funky crown position, and all of this was paired with a quadrant dial. Though some later iterations actually swapped that quadrant dial for a mystery dial, so still a little bit odd, but maybe fitting for the 60s. Regardless though, it didn't quite survive the decade. Although, as they say, what's old is new again, and in 2018 a refresh was introduced at 37mm. And even more recently, a slightly larger field watch version was announced. And lastly, a quick word about the brand. Now, this is a very old Swiss brand, but unlike a lot of its contemporaries, it never quite found that same level of success. In fact, at one point, they even declared bankruptcy, only later on to be acquired by an American company. And for this last riddle, we're going to call this one the Texas Timex. This is another Swiss-made watch with an in-house Swiss-made movement. It is easily one of the most iconic, recognizable, and prestigious watches in that brand's history. And when you know the brand, that's actually saying something. It was introduced in the late 1950s, and it's easily identifiable by its appearance, use of precious metals, extra functionality, and bracelet. In fact, the bracelet itself is also a bit iconic, as well as exclusive, as it's reserved just for this specific model. You could also say that this watch is tied to American history, as over the years it's not only been seen in various movies and television shows, but also on the wrists of the very successful, including leaders of industry and the nation. And lastly, if you're actually interested in getting a new one, well, good luck. And with that, we're 5 riddles down. That means it's time for the answers, as well as this is the last chance you have to pause the video if you're not ready. So, ready or not, here we go. Let's start off with number 1, not an SKX. And for this one, we have the Citizen Fugu. I believe the original reference numbers all started with NY0040. And this blue one was actually one of my very first divers. Supposedly, the nickname came about due to the unique bezel cutouts. For a while, this was Citizen's answer to the SKX. And while it never got quite as popular, it did develop quite a cult following, especially when they all started disappearing and we weren't sure if they were discontinued. But Citizen recently introduced some new Fugu models, although they are a little bit larger as well as have a new caseback design. Yet they all still maintain that iconic left-sided crown position. For number 2, the King of Cool, we have the Tag Heuer Monaco. This squarish racing chrono was originally introduced in 1969 with the caliber 11 movement, which, if I remember correctly, was actually a joint effort between a number of watch companies to develop one of the first automatic chronograph movements. Although recently, for the watch's 50th anniversary, Tag made news by developing their own new in-house movement for it. And if you haven't figured it out already, that riddle name, the King of Cool, is in reference to one of Steve McQueen's nicknames, who helped make this watch the legend it is. Moving on to number 3, the Mini. For this, we have the Orient Triton, which is also known as the Orient Neptune, and for a while was also known as the Mini OSD, or Orient Saturation Diver, just due to its similar appearance to the much more expensive Orient Saturation Diver. It's a little large, but it is a fantastic watch by Orient, and it's really loved by Orient fans just for being a pure spec monster. At its introduction, there weren't many watches in its price range with both Sapphire and an ISO-rated diver's water-resistant rating, as well as it's one of the few Orients that had a power reserve indicator. Now unfortunately, Orient did discontinue the Neptune, only to introduce a somewhat neutered version, one that's missing both that power reserve indicator and that diver's ISO rating. And us Orient fans are still left wondering why. Number 4, the Never Been Caught. And I'm hoping this one was a little bit harder because it's not quite as well known as some of the other watches. But for this one, it's the Zodiac Olympus. They're sort of funky sports dress watch with a 2 o'clock crown position that's integrated into what's often referred to as a manta ray case. And if you didn't know it, the actual original Zodiac brand was basically dead by the 90s, only for Fossil to later on buy the rights and resurrect it. And as for the riddle name, Never Been Caught, that's a reference to the Zodiac killer who was never caught, and was known to sign his letters with the brand's logo. And lastly, for number 5, we have the iconic Rolex Day-Date, with its equally iconic presidential bracelet, which is one of the reasons this watch is also known as the Rolex President. Well, that, and it's also a watch that's been worn by a number of US presidents. Now, the riddle's name, Texas Timex, is actually a nickname for the Day-Date, and if you happen to know that, then this would have been easy. But if not, it's an interesting tidbit of history. If I remember right, this dates back to when LBJ was president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and for some reason he had some minor surgery and he decided to show off some reporters his scar. Now, in this photo, you can clearly see he's wearing a Day-Date, and this was huge publicity for Rolex at the time. As well as it just became this whole thing, this trend to buy one, and especially in Texas, LBJ's home state, and particularly among those involved in the oil industry. This actually continued on well past Johnson's presidency, but the watch became so prevalent in certain circles that it was just as common to see a Day-Date there as it was to see a Timex on the street. So as a joke, people just started referring to it as the Texas Timex. And that wraps up Watch Riddles Part 2. As usual, let me know down below what you think about all of this, as well as how many right answers you got. And let me know if you thought this was too easy. And if you did think it was too easy, feel free to reference some historic yet obscure watches I could use for the next one. As always, you guys know what to do down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.